I want to welcome everybody here today. I know we've got a lot of material to cover. I should introduce a couple of people. I'm Matthew Orr. I'm the owner, founder, and chief architect for VoIPTools. Sarah is my chief of staff and basically keeps the business running and keeping everybody on their toes. So that's who's participating today from our staff. I should note that I am in rural England right now, and the fact that I can have any kind of audio conversation is kind of surprising. So if the audio quality from my end isn't that good, I apologize, but it is what it is. When you're in rural England, you got to deal with DSL. So that's kind of where we start. I think the first thing that we should probably start talking about when talking about our APIs is with the relay. And we support both Windows and Linux in our API. And so let's talk about some of the stuff that gets installed on the 3CX server and how that relates to our API. So the first thing, of course, is that you're going to install the 3CX phone system. And there's a couple of parts to that phone system when you install it. And that's the 3CX call control API and the call flow designer. We won't be talking much about the call flow designer today, but certainly when developing custom solutions, the call flow designer is very much a part of this whole process. And in order to talk to the 3CX call control API, we have what we call the VoIPTools relay agent. And it hosts our REST API and our events API. And the relay connects to the 3CX call control API. So when you want to talk to 3CX, you talk to 3CX through our relay API. So whether you're talking about our tools or a custom tool that you develop, there's going to be another server involved in this process. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that 3CX doesn't support installing anything on the 3CX server that isn't 3CX software. So SQL Server is not permitted to be installed on the 3CX server, nor is, get this to go, there we go, nor is IIS, which is the web server that we use for our tools. And of course, that also includes all of our tools. So recording manager, wallboards, dialers, call center tools, data replication, all of those tools that we've developed can't be installed on the 3CX server, partially because they're dependent on SQL Server and IIS for the user interface. And that also includes your custom tools. So how do our applications and any custom applications that we develop communicate with 3CX? Well, the good news is that they can communicate over the internet through HTTPS. And for your custom development tools, you can also implement JWT. So we support both HTTPS and JWT. So it's a secure connection between the 3CX server and the VoIPTools server or the server that's running your custom application. But this is a lot of stuff. Let's simplify the screen a little bit just to talk about the things that you actually need in order to develop your own applications using our API. So on the 3CX server, you're going to have the 3CX phone system, generic install. Then you're going to install our VoIPTools relay, and we have a Windows version and a Linux version, so either flavor of 3CX is fine. But a couple of things to note is that if you're hosting your 3CX server on the 3CX infrastructure, on their hosting solution, they don't permit you to have any third-party tools. They don't even allow their own third-party tool, which is the call control API. So there's a lot of restrictions that 3CX puts on anybody that's trying to do customizations. You don't even get access to parameters through the 3CX console. So yeah, 3CX really clamps that server down. So that's one thing to remember, is that if you're needing to build a custom solution, you really can't do that if your 3CX server is hosted with 3CX. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about this 3CX call control API, because there are some challenges associated with that API, and it is through that API that we communicate and make changes to 3CX. But there's some roadblocks to doing that. And one is that 3CX doesn't provide any support for the call control API, nor do they have any public documentation that is easily accessible. It only responds to local host. So you remember in the diagram that I showed you that they want you to install all of your third-party applications on a separate server. That's fine, except for the fact that the 3CX call control API doesn't respond to anything but local host. So that's a bit problematic when they're asking you to install your software elsewhere. There are, the 3CX call control API is really very truly extensive. And we've been building add-on tools for 3CX for about, I think about 14, 15 years now. And so I don't think that we've used more than maybe half of the APIs that they actually have available. But even so, there are a lot of APIs that are needed that 3CX doesn't provide when you're looking at this from the context of having to communicate with 3CX from a separate server. For example, let's say you need to upload a prompt that gets played in a call flow designer application. There's no facility for accessing or uploading or deleting files. So in addition to the 3CX call control API, we're going to have to come up with some additional tools because it's not going to be sufficient for everything that you're going to need to do. The call control API, if you've looked at it before, is not at all straightforward. In fact, getting a reliable connection to the call control API and making sure that that connection stays valid for long periods of time can be problematic. So there's a number of challenges just with interacting with the call control API. Perhaps the worst part of dealing with the call control API is that 3CX makes changes fairly regularly without warning and without concern for those who are building third-party applications. They do what they want to do. And I understand as a business owner, 3CX can't be hobbled by the fact that there are people that have built third-party tools for their software. But that's just something that you have to be aware of, is that they can make changes at any time that will break your code. And the last thing that I wanted to note was that there is no API for the client applications, 3CX Phone for Windows, iPhone, Android, web, and the PWA Electron client. There's no APIs for those. You could probably do something kind of hacky to make changes to those applications, but it would certainly be frowned upon by 3CX. So then the next question is, why do we need the relay? So let's kind of talk about some of the benefits. Remember, you can't access the call control remotely. So with the relay, now we can communicate with the call control API. We use a very simple modern approach, which is REST for those situations where you want to pose a question to 3CX and get a response back with data. We also communicate over SignalR for events, for subscribing to events. I have seen a lot of people build integrations with 3CX by manipulating data directly in the Postgres SQL database that 3CX uses for all of their data. And I can tell you that doing so is a almost instant situation where you're going to get your 3CX server flagged as unsupported. 3CX is really quite militant about this. In fact, there was a time where VoIPTools was providing technical support for 3CX when they had regional support centers. So if you called 3CX technical support from the United States or Canada, you got us rather than 3CX. So I have a really good idea of how 3CX feels about some of these things from a support standpoint. And trust me, you do not want 3CX to know if you're going and tinkering around in the Postgres SQL database. In other words, don't do it because you'll get your server flagged as unsupported. And that's not the way to run a production system. Our relay gives us the ability to leverage 14 years of development experience with building add-on tools. So we're building libraries and enhancing those libraries all the time. So when we build applications today, there's a lot of things that we don't have to refigure out. We just create a library and then use those libraries. We'll talk a little bit more about those libraries later. You also get the benefit of the fact that because we have commercial products out there that are being used in, I don't even know how many countries now. The last time I checked was a couple of years ago, and we were over 90 countries around the world and a couple thousand customers. So a lot of people out there testing our code, as well as our internal developers and QA department testing our code. So we find bugs usually before most of our customers are even aware that there's an issue. Again, we also provide additional capabilities that aren't currently offered by the 3CX call control API. And the fact is that because your applications don't talk directly to 3CX, but rather talk to our relay, that insulates your applications from some of those surprises when 3CX makes changes to their APIs behind the scenes. The theory here is that we update the relay and all of our applications instantly become compatible with the latest version of 3CX. So you using our APIs and our relay to communicate with 3CX insulates you from some of the unpleasantness that is possible when 3CX makes changes. That does imply something, and that is that when 3CX comes out with a new service pack or a new version, you got to give us a little time to test and address any issues that came up. That's usually a good idea anyway. I've always said that when 3CX comes out with a full release, which I think the next one will be 20, because I guess version 19 is an unlucky number in some countries, so they're going to skip version 19 and go straight to 20. They did the same thing with 13. They went from 12 to 14 because, of course, 13 is supposedly an unlucky number. So when 3CX releases a full version, I always tell our customers that it's probably wise, if possible, to wait until around the Service Pack 3 period to make sure that all of the features that were in 3CX previously are now available in the new version, because one could make an argument that 3CX uses Service Pack 1, 2, and 3 as what the rest of the world would call Beta 1, 2, and 3. So we encourage you to not turn on automatic updates on your 3CX server so that we have an opportunity to do some testing whenever 3CX releases a new version. I will say this, that as an example, when version 18 Alpha 1 came out, we immediately updated all of our test servers to version 18, and we continued testing all the way from Alpha 1, Alpha 2 release candidate, Beta 1, Beta 2 release candidate, and then the final release. The thing to remember, though, is that 3CX is not opposed to adding changes between the last release candidate and the official released version. So when the official release version comes out, we still have to go through and test all of our commercial and custom applications that we've developed for our customers. And that takes a minimum of about 2 weeks. So my suggestion, my strong urging is that you resist the temptation to go to the latest version as soon as it's released. Also, because the relay now allows you to communicate with 3CX from a remote server, a lot of the resource demands that are necessary to run these applications that you're developing and we're developing are now moved over to a separate server. So it minimizes the resource demands that are put onto the actual 3CX server. It also has an unintended benefit, and that is that, let's just be completely transparent. When you have an issue with your 3CX server, and you need to have 3CX technical support log into your server, I strongly suggest that you first uninstall the relay and any code that you've got on that machine that could be deemed as third party. Then allow 3CX to come in, fix your issue, and get out, and then reinstall the relay. It only takes maybe 2-3 minutes to install the relay. It's really quite simple to install. So uninstalling it and reinstalling it is what I would recommend. And of course, because SQL Server and IIS and all of our applications and all of your applications are on a separate server, really the only visibility that 3CX has is the relay. So remove the relay, let them do their thing, put the relay back in. Now, I will be straightforward with you, and that is that in the 14, 15 years that we've been doing this, I can only think of 1 or 2 times where we were the cause of an issue with 3CX. And we resolved those issues within a day or so. So I think that's a pretty good track record for 15 years, that only a couple times did we have a minor effect on the 3CX server itself. Okay, so having said that, let's move on. Also secure communication through HTTPS and through JWT authorization. So if you're building your own tools and you want to communicate with 3CX and you want to use JWT that is supported by our relay, we're still working on getting JWT implemented in all of our commercial tools, but it's there available in the relay if you want to implement JWT in your own applications. I should also point out that we support filtering who has access to the relay and the API by IP address. So you can restrict it right from within the relay if you're not comfortable with doing that in your edge firewall. You can also do that in the relay. So some of you may be aware that around Alpha 1 of version 18, 3CX announced that they were going to make available a new REST API. They promised that it would have full support, documentation, and I was pretty excited about that because frankly, I just as soon not have to dig in the call control API to do things that could be done more easily through a REST API. And things looked promising. A couple of months later, they released a web meeting API. But since then, it's been radio silence. There's a thread on the 3CX forums where management at 3CX were very vocal about what you were going to be able to do in the API and when it was going to get released. And I've noticed that a number of people over the last couple of months have said, any news? And it's just been absolute radio silence. Haven't heard anything from anyone. If any of you have heard something, I'd love to know about it. But as far as I know, it's just been kind of silence. I guess I have to admit that I'm not entirely surprised because over the 15 years that we've been doing this, 14, 15 years, 3CX has announced API that's going to be fully supported, and they've talked about having certification processes for third-party application developers, and each time it gets to a certain level and then nothing happens. So I don't know, maybe they'll release the REST API tomorrow. And if they do, I will jump on my chair and swing my arms around and say, hallelujah. But for now, there isn't one. And there isn't any indication that there's going to be one anytime soon. Well, maybe we could spend a minute then taking a look at our API and kind of look at that. So I'll just drag this guy over here. So the relay is accessed through a web interface. You log in with your extension or 3CX admin credentials. So this is the main user interface. A couple of things to note up here in the corner is that it goes out and checks to see if there's a newer version available. You'll want to stay up on the latest version of the relay. So I encourage you to do that. If there is a newer version available, you can click on it and it'll automatically download and install the latest version. So it's pretty straightforward to get it done. Don't forget that you do have to register the relay with a license key in order to use our API. There are a couple of exceptions to that rule. We have a couple of free tools, and those tools talk with 3CX. So we have made a couple of relatively minor APIs available without a license key to support our free tools. But generally speaking, in order to use our APIs, you'll need to get a license key and register your relay. To access the API, you go over here into the left-hand pane and expand this, and you can click on the REST API. And remember, I'm in rural England, so it's going to take a little bit. Well, that was pretty good, actually. Click on that, and it will display a list of APIs, and there's a lot of them. So if there's things that you want to do in 3CX, keep in mind that all of our commercial tools communicate with 3CX through this exact same API. In fact, I'll have to admit to something that's a little bit embarrassing. This API started out its life as a internal API that we had no intent in sharing with the outside world. So if you look at some of the naming conventions of these APIs, they aren't strictly following the REST pattern, but the usage is pretty much the same. And there are some that follow there isn't really a standard for REST, but some accepted practices for how to configure REST. But here they are, and maybe we could take a look at a couple of them. Let's see if there's one here that we can. So here's a bunch of call control APIs. So making calls, dropping calls, transferring calls, barging, whisper, listen, all of those kinds of call control APIs are in our API. So if you want to place a call or transfer a call or drop a call, those are all in here. And you might see that there's several different iterations or versions of those APIs. If you look there, you can see that there's several make call APIs. And the reason for that is that depending on the situation, you may want to do make call with active connection rather than an extension number, or you might want to make a telephone call and play an audio file. So there's a number of different iterations of make call. So let's go down and find one that
Matthew, do you have a question?
Oh, okay, cool. Is it possible to make a call on a certain extension through the REST API? Absolutely, sure. So make call, let's just back up there and look real quick. So we'll take the first make call, go here, try it out. So if you look, it's expecting as a parameter a JSON string that identifies who the call is from and the number that it's going to. So in this example, it's between two extensions, but more typically it would be an extension to an outside number. So this from extension could be an IVR, for example, because IVRs have an extension number. So if you wanted to call an outside party and play a message and give them menu options, like if you'd like to talk to customer service, press 1, you can do that. You can do a make call between an IVR and an outside party, or an extension to an outside party, or an extension to extension. Yeah, you can do all of those kinds of things. And because it's REST, you absolutely could do that from Visual FoxPro. All right, so this isn't really a good example, but for showing you how you can actually run an API right from within here, but let's get one that would. So if we go over here to extensions, so this one, a post means that I'm going to create an object. A get is that I'm going to request an object, right? So we'll go in here to get, and we'll try it out, and we'll put an extension number, and this one happens to be mine, but you didn't see that, and execute. And then if we go here, you can see all the data about my extension, yeah? So you can try these APIs right from within the documentation. What's another example? So if you look at these, they are kind of grouped by the type of object that you're working with. So a DN extension, kind of the same thing. So these are APIs for manipulating extensions, APIs for creating folders, copying folders, reading folders, those kinds of things. Lots of group functionality. Matthew. Oh, yeah. While you're on the APIs, the other thing we'd like to do is launch the customer account in our Visual FoxPro. Oh, sure. So what you want to do is you want to do a screen pop in Visual FoxPro is what I think you're asking for. So FoxPro is a, last I checked, and I haven't touched FoxPro in probably 25, 30 years. Last I checked, it was a Windows application. And Windows applications don't really lend themselves to doing screen pops. Might be possible to do. I've looked at it a couple of times in ancient history and couldn't quite figure out a way to do that in a Windows application, but you certainly could subscribe to an event within FoxPro. And then if you can figure out a way to do the screen pop when you get notified that an event took place, then I'd say, sure. Certainly do that all the time in our applications. So a qualified yes would be my answer. Taking your example a little bit further, we've got a couple of applications to do this. Our wrap-up codes application, for example, subscribes to call events. And so it sits in the notification area, bottom right-hand corner of Windows, and it just sits there listening for telephone calls. And when it sees that my extension has either placed a call or answered a call, it'll do a screen pop and pop up a Windows application. And it'll display all the information that we know about that telephone call. So if it's an inbound call, it would display things like the caller ID name and number, and what telephone number, what DID did they dial to get to us. If it came in through a queue, what the queue was that it came in through, start time, duration. And then we have some more things that we can do when working with our power dialer. So we can display things like work order numbers and job IDs and stuff like that. So yeah, I think the kinds of things that you're looking at doing sound feasible. It's just been too long since I touched Visual Fox Pro to speak with any real authority about that. All right, so groups. So you can create groups, you can delete groups, you can add people to groups and remove people from groups. You can log them in and out of queues, all those kinds of things. You can create office hours. You can inquire on what the office hours are and holidays are. You can look up what the paths are for where recording files are being stored. So if you wanted to upload a recording or download a recording, for example, because in 3CX you can specify a non-standard location for recordings, it would be important for you to know where those recordings are being saved. So the first query would be, what's the path to the recording? The second API call would be, give me the recording that's in this folder structure based on the root structure that I got from the first API. So yeah, so lots of file manipulation, folder manipulation, APIs, being able to push prompt files up to the 3CX server. That's important if, for example, you're creating a IVR through our API and you want to set what the prompt is that's going to be used by that IVR. Something like, welcome to VoIPTools, our offices are now closed. If this is an emergency, press 1. So a prompt like that, you would need to upload that prompt, then create the IVR and assign that prompt to the IVRs. Queue-related APIs for manipulating queues. Same thing with recordings. These are general server ones. Like an interesting one is to check what version of 3CX you're running to make sure that your software is compatible with the version of 3CX that's running. So that's some of the types of, what's the time zone for the server, what's the culture of the server, those kinds of things. And then here's an important one. These are all the tables within 3CX Postgres database. And remember, I told you that if you touch the Postgres database, you're going to be in a lot of trouble with 3CX. We have kind of an unspoken agreement with 3CX that they will allow our API to access the Postgres database. And they haven't really given us an official okay, because 3CX has no mechanism for getting third-party tools approved. But I have talked to 3CX many, many times about this API and offered to remove these APIs if they had a problem with it. And they said, no, don't do that. And I think I can only guess at why they took this position. But my guess is that they've had lots and lots of people around the world trying to get in and tinker with Postgres, and they don't realize some very simple facts. As an example, one of the most common tools for working with Postgres database is pgadmin. And if you connect to a Postgres database in pgadmin and you navigate down to where the tables are and you click on the table name, you don't open it, you don't do anything but click on the name, that locks that table. And that means that 3CX can neither read or write to any records in that table. So doing something that you would think is fairly innocuous actually can be devastating to 3CX. So while the official policy is that thou shalt not touch the Postgres database, they have allowed us to do it because the alternative is to have people all around the world trying to figure out how to do this safely themselves. And it's better to deal with the devil you know than the devil you don't know. That's my guess as to how this has happened. So you can access all of those historical records, Q statistics, all of those things through our API, and you won't get into trouble from 3CX for doing it. Now, let's be clear. We were very, very, very careful about how we connected to the Postgres database to make sure that it was a read-only connection. And as an example, some of the experience that we've gotten over the years doing this is that Postgres curiously gets upset if you ask for more than 500 records at a time. So with all of our APIs that access the Postgres database, you specify the starting index and how many records you want to return, but it won't let you return more than 500 at a time. Now, you can keep asking the API for the next 500 and the next 500. That's fine. But for whatever reason, it doesn't like you pulling more than 500 records at a time. Well, if you don't know that, it seems very reasonable that somebody would go into the Q statistics table and say, give me all the Q statistics. And bad things happen when you do that. So that's just an example of one of the things that we've learned over the years of doing this kind of stuff, that somebody that's new to working with the Postgres database might not know. So our exporter tool leverages these APIs. And so it will go and it will look at what's the last record in that table that was replicated to SQL Server. And it'll say, okay, give me the next 500. And so we're replicating that data out of the Postgres database over into Microsoft SQL Server or MySQL. And then you can create your reports and do all the kinds of manipulation of data that you want in that replica of the data. And you can do whatever you want. And because it's all running on a separate server, if somebody writes a very inefficient report that says, give me all of the calls from the beginning of time in reverse order, sorted by extension, that could potentially be a really, really intensive report. But who cares? It's running on a separate server with a separate copy of the data. And so that's kind of one of the things that we do with our API. So there's a bunch more APIs, but I think you get kind of the idea that this is how our API works. You can try any one of these right from the documentation itself. And of course, that then means it is important that you secure your relay, that you're implementing SSL, that you're using JWT for your custom applications, that you're restricting what IP addresses can get access to the relay, because we don't want somebody to figure out how to get into your relay and start doing bad stuff. Because you can delete queues, you can delete extensions, you can do just about anything with our API. So you definitely want to make sure that you restrict it. All right, so this is our REST-based API. So let's back up a little bit and kind of look at how you subscribe to real-time events. All right, so going back over here to the API documentation. This one here, I'm not quite sure why the development team decided to put it here. This is just a test tool that we use. Remember, when you're building applications, particularly with those applications that use the call flow designer, if that call flow designer needs to access data in a database, remember, 3CX doesn't want you installing a database on the 3CX server, and they most certainly don't want you tinkering with and creating your own tables and manipulating data in the Postgres database. So that implies that your database server is going to be elsewhere. Typically in our environment, it would be on the VoIPTools, the separate VoIPTools server. And so you want to be able to test whether or not the call flow designer application that needs access to the database can authenticate to the SQL server. And so what you would do is paste your SQL connection string in here and then press the test connection. And then it's going to do things like check. First of all, can I resolve the SQL server name? We'll put the FQDN there, but they're running 3CX in the cloud with no DNS, and so it can't resolve that FQDN. So that might be one of the problems. Or it could be that they don't have the necessary ports open on the firewall that's protecting the SQL server, like the Windows firewall or Edge perimeter firewall. Or they may have configured SQL Server. They may have forgotten to configure SQL Server to allow remote connections. So this is a simple little tool that allows us to paste in the SQL connection string and then test to see whether we can communicate with that SQL Server. Now, the truth is that you should never be doing this in the first place. You do not want to expose your SQL Server to the outside world. So this is okay if you've got your 3CX and your SQL Server within the same secure network. But if you've got your 3CX server on Amazon and your SQL Server on-prem, better have some good firewall rules in there to make sure that unscrupulous people don't have access to your SQL Server. The better approach, of course, would be to create your own REST API in your application that's running on the SQL Server or in proximity to the SQL Server, and have your call flow designer applications doing REST queries to get the information they need, or posting data to the SQL Server rather than directly accessing the SQL Server. All right, but this is the one that you're really interested in. And this is how you can easily interact with our relay agent. Keep in mind that just as 3CX is a Microsoft.NET Core developers. We, in turn, are also Microsoft.NET Core C# developers. So our tools make the assumption that if you're building tools and you need something more than what is possible with REST, REST being a standard that you can do from pretty much any language. But if you want to subscribe to events, remember events are implemented using Microsoft's Signal R, which deep under the covers is going to be WebSockets. So to access and to subscribe to events, we've created a couple of C# DLLs that contain all of the methods that you would need to authenticate to the relay and then start asking questions like, give me a list of extensions and all their attributes. One of the other things that I should have mentioned that I didn't show you when we were looking at the REST API is that some of the APIs have a clone depth parameter that you can set to it. The way that 3CX designed their objects is an object can contain additional objects, and those objects can contain objects, and those objects can reference objects in other objects. And so if you try and clone an object, so you're grabbing an object from 3CX and you're cloning that object into your application so that you can manipulate it. You don't want to go any deeper down that rabbit hole than is necessary to get the data that you want. So clone depth defines how many objects deep you want to pull across the internet to your application, or from the 3CX server to your application. So that's an important thing to understand, is that start with a clone depth of 1. And if you don't get all the information you need, try it again with 2. I never had to go farther than a clone depth of 3. So that would be my advice to you. So you can download these DLLs and incorporate them into your project. It says here that the Relay sample project, Visual Studio sample project, is a .NET Framework 4.7.2. We have long since moved on to .NET Core, so I don't know if this download is still a .NET Framework or if somebody forgot to update this link description. But if you're developing in .NET Core, which really is kind of necessary because 3CX is now in .NET Core. So you download these DLLs, you add a reference to them in your application, and now you can access all of the methods that we've created. So if you don't know how to do a REST call and deal with JSON objects and those kinds of things, you can use our DLL and just say, get extensions, and it'll return extension objects, native extension objects with all their properties configured, and you don't have to know anything about converting JSON to an object, and you don't have to know what the object structure is because it's returning the object. So you just say var extension list, and it'll dump everything in there. All right, so we also have, as I mentioned, a Visual Studio sample project that you can use to kind of get started. So it'll kind of walk you through step by step how to authenticate with the 3CX server. Well, authenticate to the relay, and then the relay is already authenticated to the call control API. So how to authenticate, and then how to subscribe to events. And the number of events, I don't even know how many events there are, but as examples, there will be events for connection events. Connection events largely is synonymous with phone call events. So if you want to know when somebody's dialed a telephone number, that's a create event. If you want to know when somebody is calling in, that's a create event, but it's also an update event when that call gets answered by an IVR or by a user. If somebody hangs up, it's going to be a delete event, of course. And it gets pretty ugly, I'll be honest with you. Interpreting the events, which don't necessarily come in order, can be a daunting task, but it's doable. And so here's some sample code that we've got in here. If you just want to take a look at how to subscribe to events and some of the different types of events there are. So connection events are call events. DN events would be somebody creating an extension or edited an extension property or something like that. Forwarding rules, group events, parameters. There's a whole bunch of them in there. So we show you how to subscribe to all these different kinds of events. So when somebody answers a queue call, when a call goes and gets transferred into a queue, when a call gets answered by an IVR, these are all the kinds of events that you can subscribe to. All right, so where shall we go from here? Oh, I know. Let's take a look at our monitor tool. I think this is a good segue. So this is a tool that I wrote many years ago when I was first learning or trying to discover what kinds of events take place as a call progresses from the ringing state to the answer state and being transferred from an IVR to a queue to an agent. And if it was a three-way call or something like that, these all generate events. And it can be pretty daunting to try and sit there and watch these events happen in real time. So I built this tool. Let me log in here. What this tool does is it listens to those connection events, those call-related events, and it grabs all of the properties data and puts it into this database so that you can see these call events in the order that they took place. And so let's take a look at this one. So this looks like this is an outbound call because it's dialing a telephone number. And now that telephone call is ringing. And the difference in time between these two is the time between when 3CX sends the invite to your SIP trunk provider and when the SIP trunk provider actually starts connecting that call to start ringing, right? So if somebody's complaining and saying that, wow, you know, I dial a telephone number and it takes forever to start ringing, this is a way that you can look and see, well, 3CX sent the invite at this time, but look, it took 3, 4, 5 seconds before the SIP trunk provider actually started ringing that telephone call. So you can just go through all of these events, and it's not at all straightforward. I'll tell you that right now. We've spent years learning how to interpret this, but there's some simple things that you can do. Like if you see a dialing event, you know that somebody has dialed a telephone number and who dialed the telephone number. So you look at some of these other columns. So right now it's grouped by date. You can see that here, and by history ID. And for those of you that aren't familiar with how 3CX structures and keeps track of telephone calls, when a call is created within 3CX, each telephone call is given a unique history ID. I think the actual property name is history ID of the call. So it's a pretty long, ugly name for that field, but it's a unique value that follows that call everywhere it goes. So if a call comes in, goes to an IVR, then goes to a queue, then goes to an agent, then gets transferred to a manager, and then the manager transfers it to somebody else, and it ends up in voicemail. That history ID is going to follow that call everywhere it goes. So that's how we can go here and grab let's grab one that doesn't extend beyond the page. That's how we group these records together, is by the history ID. So, and based on the date and time, we can show you a sequential order in which this happens. So I never intended to show this tool to anyone. I developed it for my own purposes, but over the years, I got asked for a tool like this over and over and over again. So I finally said, well, okay, fine, we'll make it available. So this is a great tool when you're first starting to learn, what does a call look like as it's progressing from step to step within 3CX? What do the events look like? What order do they happen? And then that helps you to respond appropriately in your code based on the events that you're being sent from the 3CX call control API via subscribing to an event on our relay. So I really didn't have any intent in getting into writing code here. So let's kind of wrap this up. But let me just say thank you. Appreciate you giving us some of your day today. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us by email, by live chat, by phone. We've got staff available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. I will say this, though, that for API development questions, while it is fully documented and supported, we're not going to write the code for you. We will give you guidance on what's the best API and how to use the Active Connections API and respond to your questions. So it is a supported API, but at some point, you've got to be responsible for writing the code and debugging the code, and we're not going to do that for you. So with that, I will thank you for your time. I appreciate it.